There's a new VP of marketing at a university. He's 4 months into the job, and he's sharing a presentation on all these website updates that they're making. And he gets on the call, he starts screen sharing, but lo and behold, he makes a screen share mistake and he shares the wrong screen.
Hi everyone, I'm excited for you to have a listen to this week's episode of We're Not Recording. Today, Melanie and I unpack a hypothetical situation about a screen share and AI gone wrong, and it turns into an interesting discussion about culture and values and how you kind of get everyone aligned and on the same page about that. And while I've got you, I'd love to briefly draw your attention to Athena, the company that Melanie and I work for. It is a compliance training platform that offers a whole bunch of courses your company probably needs, like harassment prevention and code of conduct. And if you're ever interested, or your HR or legal teams are, please send them our way. Thanks. Melanie, you had a brilliant idea for a topic based on, I believe, like a conference you went to?
Yep.
Tee it on up.
So I was just at a Troop HR retreat, and one of the sessions that they did was a case study, and they basically explored a scenario, and we were tasked with responding on how we should address the situation, especially if we were the HR person in charge of it. And the reason I wanted to bring it up is because my response was very much in the minority, and so I wanted to see what your take is.
Were you the only, or was it just in the minority?
I think I was one of two people who had my perspective. Yeah. So
Okay.
I don't know if anyone else was sitting on their thoughts and just didn't share. So here's the context. Okay. I'm just going to set the stage. So there's a new VP of marketing at a university. He's 4 months into the job, and he's sharing a presentation on all these website updates that they're making. And he gets on the call, he starts screen sharing, but lo and behold, he makes a screen share mistake and he shares the wrong screen. And what he shares instead is an article that he was reading about how, as a result of AI, we are basically projecting that, like, the world is projecting that 20% of marketing jobs are in the tech industry are going to be cut and replaced by AI. And unbeknownst to him, in the chat section of the video call, a bunch of junior employees are panicking and going wild. Why is he reading that? Are our jobs at risk? What does this mean? And then finally somebody speaks up and says, hey, I think you're presenting the wrong screen. What I'm seeing is a post about marketing employee layoffs. And that's the end. And so the question is, how should this leader respond? And how should the company respond, if at all? Curious, before I bias you, what's your take here?
I mean, my take is, okay, if we broke it down to its component parts, it'd be like, are we upset that he screen shared the wrong thing? I think unless there's a pattern, it'd be like, no. I had just the most horrendous experience where I was on a medium-sized external call and screen shared my inbox, and it, I felt like the dumbest person on the planet. But I'd say, like, as long as that wasn't a pattern behavior, I'd be like, okay, the screen share fail is sort of we've all been there, that's fine. Then if it's like, is it bad that he was reading an article about AI job loss? And I would actually have a very strong stance here, which is, I would be upset if I had a VP of marketing who wasn't paying attention to what AI was doing in the labor force. And so, no, I wouldn't be like, we're not acting like he was reading sort of terrorist propaganda or something. Like, I'm like, nothing about the substance of this is problematic. And in fact, I think it's like professional development. I am really pushing everybody, whether they want to or not, to understand and be experts in how AI is changing their field, because in the same way that if we had someone join our team and they're like, hey, I'm not really much of a Zoom call person. It'd be like, well, that's kind of the technology that we use. And so no, we're not all going to work around and call your cell phone every time we need to talk to you. I feel like this is, sort of on a larger scale, but very much like that. It's an expectation of all of my leaders. And so then it would just be are we upset that people were sort of doom spiraling in the chat? And, do we want to talk with him about having a more open conversation about where he thinks AI is going in marketing and how his team should prepare and all of that. But like in some ways, I'm sort of like looking at this scenario, being like, if you came to me and you're like, Roxanne, really bad news, and then you like told me this scenario, but replaced this fictitious university with Chris, our team member, I would be like, this is like definitely the least bad news anyone has ever given me. Like I'm not getting anything here where I'm like, oh no, like,
Yeah.
like we need to trigger like X, Y, or Z response. I'm kind of like, I'm not really seeing it.
Interesting. Okay, and one follow-up question for you.
Yeah.
So you commented on the employees sort of panicking and like, hey, do we need to have a more transparent conversation with them? What is your perception there? Like, is like, what do you think is the underlying issue that's leading to employees panicking, and are you cool with them panicking, or like, does that make you feel some type of way?
Oh no, I wouldn't like if for some reason I'm really struggling with hypothetical, so I'll just stick with in this
Yeah,
example, Chris.
yeah.
And if people on Chris's team suddenly on a Zoom chat were like, "Oh my gosh, what does this mean?" and stuff, I'd be like, "Hey folks, like I think my take would just be like that's not really the place for this kind of conversation." But then I would think it would be very reasonable if they wanted to have, a one-on-one, a team meeting with Chris after to like share their concerns. I think that is totally reasonable for them to say like, "Hey, here's what we're concerned about." I would guess in this situation it's something like the root cause may be that Chris, poor Chris, this is not Chris, but that Chris like hasn't had a proactive conversation with his team about AI and how he thinks it's changing marketing and how it might cause him to, hire different roles even in the next 6 months. That would be my guess. If I learned that like, no, Chris actually has been having these discussions, but like the team is just really kind of hell bent on doom spiraling about AI, then I'd be like, this is just unproductive. Like, this is sort of the take your whole self to work that I don't buy, just like, no, you need to take your like productive, I'm here to get stuff done kind of self to work.
It's fascinating hearing your thought process here, because in the interest of sharing a different perspective, I'll share what was loudest in the room as we were doing this case study. And the context for the record is this is a group of HR professionals. So the the response that I actually heard during that case study was primarily around all the areas in which the leader fell short. So, that was a really big mistake. Clearly, they need to be better prepared for the call or calls moving forward. And, 4 months in, clearly this is a sign that they haven't built enough trust with the team, because if they had, employees wouldn't be panicking, which isn't quite what you were saying, but touches on it, right? Have they been having some of these conversations? But in this light, it was more a focus on like, have they built trust, a relationship where employees won't panic in general? And then separately, there was a lot of like, let's explore like the unique culture of an education, of the
Hmm.
education industry, right? And like cultural expectations there might be different, more junior
Oh, you're
employees.
very correct that I blew right past that one because I do have a friend in an education nonprofit, and holy smokes, like we approach things very different.
Yeah, very different culture, right? And so, what was interesting to me was it did give me pause to think about, wow, my mind didn't go there at all. Like, my mind actually went in a much firmer direction, which was, I think maybe somewhere in between the two, which is, I actually think the problem is that employees, especially our junior employees, to your point, think this is an appropriate forum for this discussion and think that this is the right place and way to have that discussion. That there was no assumption of good intent. Obviously, we can talk about like why there is an assumption of good intent, what cultural problems that we have, but basically, where my mind went was, I don't actually think that that employers or companies should have the culture dictated by the employees and the employee needs. I think a company should decide what culture they want and they think is most effective to furthering their business needs, and then they should set that expectation in the recruitment process with existing employees and even during performance management. And so, what was interesting to me was in the room, it seemed like it was really about how do we understand employee needs and cater to that, and my perspective was very much like, no, no, no. How do I make employees adapt to the employer culture? Or in worst case, we part ways if we are not,
Mm.
in fact, aligned. I'm curious to hear like what your take is there, having heard that.
No issue with something that is not to my taste, but that is clear. So if you are saying that this university had a culture that is not the culture and I, Roxanne Petraeus, would thrive in, but is really clear and had like employee stakeholder activism kind of values, then I'm like, oh yeah, this guy's probably gonna have to go do a big old sensing session, an apology tour,
Mm.
and whatever that cultural values would dictate, because that is the culture of that institution.
I
I
do,
again don't think it's the right way, but
yeah.
also if the culture really was the way I was just painting it, so very like activism at its core, my way would totally flop there. If I was like, everyone get on this train, otherwise, like, you're leaving the station, I'm pretty sure I would just get fired the next day because, I would be like an antibody.
Do you think, to be clear, are you saying that that's because the education industry might expect a specific culture, or because that company expects a specific culture?
I guess I'm just assuming that, like, in this hypothetical, it sounds like this university, this company, whatever, if you're telling me that they have a very collaborative culture, then my answer is different than the answer I gave. I was giving the answer of like, Roxanne, assume it's one of your VPs. Here's what I would do. Because I think your actions have to, like, the army, for example, has a culture in general of making sure that, like, you don't want superstars and you don't want duds. You kind of want this like band in the middle. So like if you're gonna execute some complex operation, like jumping out of a plane, you don't really want anyone who's like massively innovated in this sort of space, because it's like, well, did this person communicate with everyone else? And on the flip side, you don't want someone who's like falling. You just kind of want we want uniformity. And so the Army's culture is a lot about uniformity. And I think that makes a ton of sense given the Army's mission, and taking a very tech approach of like, well, sink or swim, and we're a superstar culture, and I only need 5 superstars. And if you're not that, you're gone. And putting that in the Army's culture doesn't work, because that's not how the Army is built. It's not how they recruit. So like, I think maybe my very broad point is like, it really does depend on what the culture of the institution is. I think an institution that wants to change its culture is kind of screwed, because I think it gets so baked into the DNA that I don't really believe in like cultural shifts or turnarounds. Like, you just kind of are what you are at a certain stage. That's like my perspective. But yeah, like if this guy existed in a culture that was more NPR-y, I think that this guy needs to go on a big old apology tour, and that's how he's going to spend the next 4 months.
But if you are an institution and you've chosen that this is your culture, then yeah, I get it. This is what you've optimized for, and having a huge deviation will, negatively impact a large majority of the people that you have brought in, having literally interviewed or recruited with these particular expectations in mind. But I will say something that it also made me think about is the expectations that we put on members of the leadership team and managers in general versus expectations that we put on employees. I do think
Mm.
there's a lot of chatter around what it means to be a leader and how much work you have to do to like gain trust and so on and so forth. I don't hear nearly enough uh, sort of the onus being put on employees. Oftentimes it's
Mm.
really just like what do leaders need to do to get their employees to trust us? And I wish there was a little bit more conversation around, no, what do employees need to do to make sure that we are all working effectively together as a team?
On the one hand, I think one of the most powerful things as a leader, as a parent, I've kind of like come to realize is when you accept that everything is your fault. So as CEO of Athena, everything is my fault. Because let's just say I was like, oh my gosh, I got Melanie and she's such a pain in the ass. And I go to Steve, my husband, and I complain every week, fucking Melanie. Sorry, this is the F-bomb felt a little aggressive there.
It's okay, we'll bleep it
She's
out.
just we're not recording, it's fine. She's always causing problems and this and that. And Steve would be like, Roxanne, you can fire Melanie, right? You can coach Melanie, right? But you're just deciding to complain about this. So, like, I think the concept of extreme ownership is really powerful, whether, again, as like a parent, if I'm like, oh my gosh, I got these 2 kids, and it's like, well, guess what, lady? Like, no one made you do this. Like, just kind of like accepting that, oh my gosh, I heard this podcast, obviously, because that's all I do, that was like, it was like, ask yourself the question, what am I complicit some version of like, how am I complicit in creating the situation that is frustrating me?
Hmm.
So like not even asking, am I complicit, but like, how am I? Like,
Okay.
what have I
Yeah.
done to cause this situation? And I don't think that excuses, in my example, fictitious because you were great, of, me being so frustrated all the time about you. That doesn't excuse whatever behavior you're doing that is wrong. But as a leader, it's just kind of my job to like make you right or fix the situation in some other way. And I think it's so powerful if everyone takes that like extreme ownership mentality, because then you're never like hand wringing of just like, well, like I wish things could be better. And you're always fixing whatever's in your control. I know that there's this concept of toxic positivity, and maybe someone listening to this would be like, I have toxic positivity. I don't actually mean that. Like, I still believe there's like really crappy things that happen, and you're just like, this sucks. And still, I think the best mentality to approach them with is something, some version of like ownership, at least in professional settings. But I also hear you that I don't like this idea. Okay, this is maybe very spacey. I especially don't like in white collar work, people, employees, anyone, kind of appropriating the language of like blue collar work for white collar work. So like employees are being exploited. And it's just
Oh.
like,
Wait,
I
what? Say
don't.
more. This should have been the whole podcast. What are you
Oh,
saying right
really?
now?
Well, like I think there can be, this was like, tech a couple years ago, this idea that like if you're at Google and whatever, they took your like lunch away, that you're being exploited. And it's like,
I hear you. Okay, I hear
like,
you. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exploitation is like, I'm a migrant worker and have like very few alternatives, and maybe I'm even being physically coerced. Like, I just think there
Okay.
can be this like weaponization of language that was developed in a very different setting and brought to white collar work, where it's like, you are making 160K a year plus benefits. And like you can go make 120K a year at a company that doesn't ask you to work on the weekends. This is not exploitation.
I would agree with that. I do think people often forget that the employment contract is two-way. You can
Exactly.
quit at any point. And I don't say that in the like, screw off, we don't care. Like, of course we care. It's not strategically beneficial to the business if we can't attract and retain talent. But if you happen to not align with the values of the company and the culture doesn't, match what you're looking for, or the benefits and perks package doesn't match what you're looking for, I do agree that sometimes it's a little bit of doom spiraling of, this is unfair, you're treating me unfairly. It's sort of like, well, you don't have to work here.
Well, and that's what I mean by like approaching, like if we go back to the scenario you gave, I'm a junior marketer and I saw that my boss is thinking about replacing people with AI. If I approach that situation not from a I am powerless, but from like I am an intelligent person with agency and ownership, I feel like the things I might do is one, show up to my boss with 5 ideas on
Yeah,
how AI can improve our internal marketing, right?
yeah.
Because guess what? That's what he wants to hear. Like I there are like things you could do that aren't just I'm gonna complain about a fear I have.
Yeah, I do think it's an interesting point in particular, like when you play it all out, an employee who's sort of panicking live on a comment, what do they expect is going to happen? Do they think right there they're going to solve the problem, or that their leader, the leader of that team is going to be able to give an articulate response? Like, probably not, right? I do think sometimes there's a sort of like a lack of empathy or a lack of big picture perspective on like, hey, like, stop for a second and think this through. You're not going to get what you're looking for in this manner. But I see your point as well. As far as like, okay, but employees are going to do what employees are going to do. What do I, as the CEO or the VP of marketing, have the power within my control to change? So it's an interesting one. I don't know if there's a perfect response, but certainly in Athena's culture, I think it would be, hey, all, of course I was looking this over. Like, it's my job to stay in the know. If you've got any questions, we can chat through that further. DM me, but let's get back on track. We got new website updates to talk through.
Yeah, and I think I don't exactly know how to square this with something I was talking about yesterday, or I don't know when, which is I think the most magical thing in the world is having people at a company who tell leaders and peers that they are wrong, that their idea is
Mm,
stupid, that they need to get their stuff together. I had this example of Christina who works for me, who is flawless, but like works like, not even directly reporting to me, who, I don't know, a couple months ago was like, Roxanne, you're getting off track in this meeting. And it was like, what a blessing to have someone who is just like, because she was so right. I was like focused on something else and it wasn't the thing that was most urgent. And I think about a situation where I'm like, do I want Christina telling me I'm off track, even if she's wrong, right? Because it's like feedback isn't always right. And I'm like, I do. So it's like, why do I feel that way about Christina, but I don't feel this way about the fictitious
Mm.
marketing junior marketers? And I think it's that it's not really feedback. It's like complaints. They're not specific. So if the feedback was like, hey, you didn't give us enterprise licenses for any LLM and I want training and I want this. I'm like, okay, cool. If it's just like, I want you to tell me that my job is safe, it feels like that is sort of like, I want you to solve my work-life balance problem. I'm like, no.
Yeah, I think that's fair because, even like a reframe that targets that would be when you are thinking about, where AI steps in, what are the gaps that you would be looking to fill, or what would you be looking to prioritize in, the marketing team that you build up? It would be more solution oriented, action oriented, and just showing more agency.
But no, I mean, I think this is a decent place to end, right? Of like, I don't know, cultures are very specific to each organization. So if you're that head of marketing, like make sure that you're joining an organization that aligns with like how you operate. Because I don't think you individual get to change a culture of any organization, call it bigger than 10 people. Like that's a bit baked. That's I don't know if you agree, but I feel like.
No, I agree. Honestly, what I found most valuable from this exercise was explore really thinking through all the different factors that could impact a final outcome or the right decision. Whether it's like, hey, this member of the leadership team has only been here for 4 months, or hey, these were only junior employees who were flagging this. So is it a junior employee situation that we need to handle? Is it, the difference between the education industry versus the tech industry? All those things, they just helped me sort of realize that there are certain things that I overlook or take for granted or don't consider that could all meaningfully impact what the right solution ends up being.
Yeah, I think maybe the other thought is like hearing you unpack things helped me slightly, when you mentioned like academia has different values, I was like, oh yeah, duh.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
totally just like blew past that one initially. And so like ideally if you were a leadership team coming together to be like, how do I deal with this situation? Having a diverse group of perspectives to like workshop the situation, because like if you had had five me's, we would be like, what are those employees' names? Like, I don't know, like it's not looking good, guys. Before like really making sure that this was correct. Because I don't know, turns out that we're all humans with all of our own weird heuristics and biases and like mistakes that we're prone to make, and it's only through conversations that you can kind of unearth those.
I think that's a really great point to end it on. Well, thanks all.
It's been fun. AI is coming for your job. Just kidding, it's fine.
I've been waiting my whole life to say this. If you like this episode, please like, subscribe, and follow us on LinkedIn, because that's the only social media platform where we hang out.